The world was on fire. Europe lay in ruins. The Mediterranean churned with blood, and Italian soldiers, sons of farmers, laborers and fishermen, found themselves caught in a war they no longer believed in. They had marched under Mussolini's banner with promises of glory, only to be defeated, captured and shipped thousands of miles across the Atlantic. For men who had known only hunger, cold and the brutal discipline of the front lines, the future seemed certain: humiliation, hardship and punishment in foreign lands. But what awaited them in America was something they could never have imagined. Picture this. A train screeches to a halt in the endless fields of Texas or the rolling hills of Georgia. Italian prisoners step down, guarded yet unchained, their eyes scanning the horizon. Instead of barbed wire wastelands or dank stone cells, they see wooden barracks standing neat in rows. Instead of soldiers with whips, they find quiet order and open skies. Instead of cruelty, they are met with something deeply unsettling: comfort. The men exchanged nervous glances. Was this a trick, a dream? They had expected to be treated as enemies, as dangerous criminals. Instead, they were given warm blankets, clean cots, and even hot meals. For soldiers hardened by months of starvation rations, this felt surreal, almost absurd. It was as though stepping into captivity had brought them freedom. And so, the story begins, of Italian soldiers who entered America as prisoners, but walked into a world they could scarcely believe. It began with something so simple, yet so profound that it changed the way Italian prisoners saw their captors. It began with food. For soldiers who had lived on crusts of bread and bowls of watery broth during their campaigns in North Africa, Greece and Sicily, the idea of sitting down to a full meal felt almost like fantasy. They had marched under a sun that scorched the skin from their backs, carrying rifles with no bullets and stomachs that growled louder than artillery. The war had been cruel, not only in the fire of battle but in the relentless starvation that gnawed at them day and night. By the time many Italians were captured, their bodies were gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their uniforms loose around their bones. Hunger had become a constant companion, a reminder of their nation's weakness, their army's collapse, and their uncertain future. So when they were marched into the mess hall of an American prisoner of war camp, the shock was nearly too much to comprehend. Instead of moldy crusts or worm-eaten biscuits, trays of steaming food were waiting. Thick cuts of meat, potatoes, fresh bread still warm from the oven, beans, fruit, and almost unbelievably, coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, making the men's knees weak. Many stared at the trays in disbelief, as though the food itself might vanish if they blinked too long. Some whispered to one another, muttering words of suspicion. Was this a trick? Were they being fattened for some cruel purpose? Others crossed themselves quietly, half prayer, half thanksgiving, as if God himself had intervened. The guards urged them forward, not with beatings or curses, but with calm instructions. Plates were handed out, cups of coffee poured. The Italians sat at long wooden tables, glancing nervously at one another, none daring to take the first bite. For men who had been taught that captivity meant humiliation, that Americans would surely treat them like dogs, this abundance felt almost like mockery. Yet hunger was stronger than pride. Slowly, carefully, they lifted spoons and forks to their lips. The taste was overwhelming: salt, fat, warmth, the very things denied to them for months. A potato crushed easily under the tongue, releasing its starchy comfort. Meat, tender and savory, filled mouths that had forgotten what real nourishment tasted like. Bread, soft and fragrant, was torn apart in eager hands. The silence of suspicion broke into murmurs of astonishment, then into laughter. Soon, the hall was alive with clinking cups and the low hum of men eating not like prisoners, but like human beings again. For some, tears welled in their eyes. They remembered mothers stirring pots of pasta in village kitchens, wives carrying baskets of bread, feasts of long ago that seemed buried forever under rubble and smoke. In that American mess hall, memories returned with every bite. It was not just food, it was dignity, a reminder that life could be full again. Word spread quickly among the Italians. Prison was not starvation. Prison was not torment. In fact, many whispered that the food was better than what they had received as active soldiers in Mussolini's army. Some even dared to laugh at the irony that they were fed more generously by their enemies than by their own homeland. Meals became a daily ritual of astonishment. Breakfast brought eggs and milk. Lunch carried meat stews and bread. Supper filled their bellies with vegetables, fruit, and always more bread. Coffee became a cherished comfort, a dark and bitter luxury that lifted spirits. Cigarettes were sometimes handed out alongside meals, another token that eased the bitterness of captivity. Of course, there were those who remained uneasy. Pride was a heavy burden for soldiers who had sworn loyalty to their nation, only to be defeated. Some muttered that the Americans were softening them, making them forget the shame of defeat. Yet even the most stubborn could not deny their bodies relief. Hunger had been their enemy for so long, and now, in the most unlikely of places, that enemy was gone. And so, food became more than sustenance. It became the first bridge between captor and captive. American officers understood something critical. A well-fed prisoner was less likely to rebel, less likely to cause trouble. For Italians, however, it was more personal. Each meal chipped away at the image of Americans as brutal conquerors. Each tray of steaming stew suggested that perhaps their enemy was not the barbarian they had been told to fear. Around those mess hall tables, bonds began to form, not with the guards, but among the prisoners themselves. They laughed again, teased one another, argued over who got the largest slice of bread. Life returned in small, precious ways. A soldier who had once been too weak to lift his rifle could now stand tall after a week of hearty meals. Gaunt faces filled out, color returned to pale cheeks, and the slow rhythm of hope began to pulse again. One Italian officer later wrote in his journal that the food felt like a revelation. "I thought prison would break me. Instead, I ate better as a prisoner than as a soldier. For the first time, I was not afraid of hunger." His words echoed the sentiments of thousands, and in those moments of eating together, side by side in the mess hall, Italian soldiers realized that captivity was not what they feared. It was not humiliation. It was survival, perhaps even a strange form of salvation. The irony was sharp but undeniable. These men, who had once carried rifles against the Allies, now found themselves sustained by American bread, American coffee, American generosity. The battlefield had ended their freedom, but the camp had restored their strength. The meals marked the first step in reshaping their view of America. What had begun with suspicion ended with reluctant gratitude. Even if they remained prisoners, even if their futures were uncertain, there was no denying that life inside these camps gave them something they had lost long before capture: the simple, enduring comfort of a full stomach. The first nights in captivity were the hardest to process, not because of fear nor because of pain, but because of something far stranger: comfort. For men who had known only mud, stone, and the raw earth as their bed, the sight of an American barrack was unbelievable. Wooden walls stood firm, neat and warm. Windows let in shafts of light that cut across clean floors. Rows of bunks stretched in perfect order, each topped with a mattress, a pillow, and a folded blanket. For Italians who had often wrapped themselves in torn coats to survive the cold, these bunks looked almost luxurious. Prison, they thought, was not supposed to look like this. The first night was filled with unease. Many lay awake, listening, waiting for cruelty to come. They expected shouts, beatings, humiliation. Yet instead, the only sounds were the creak of wood, the steady breathing of men, and perhaps strangest of all, the hum of cicadas and crickets outside. For soldiers used to nights broken by gunfire and explosions, this silence felt almost threatening. And then, one by one, exhaustion overcame suspicion. Men who had not truly rested in years closed their eyes and drifted into deep sleep, wrapped in blankets that were clean and warm. Some woke startled, unable to believe they had slept through the night without interruption. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of comfort sank in. Showers were available, real showers with warm water. At first, the Italians were shy, unused to stripping down in organized lines. They had bathed in rivers, ditches, and puddles, if at all. Soap was a rare treasure. Now, they lathered their skin, washed their hair, and let the heat of the water ease their aching muscles. The dirt of months washed away. Men emerged clean, fresh, almost reborn. Some laughed as they scrubbed, shaking their heads in disbelief that prisoners of war could live with such dignity. The barracks themselves became symbols of stability. Each bed had a place. Each man had a space to call his own. There was no chaos, no desperate scramble for shelter, no fear of being left outside in the rain. Guards inspected the barracks not with cruelty, but with discipline, reminding prisoners to keep things tidy. The Italians complied, partly out of habit, partly out of gratitude. Soon, the barracks gleamed, floors swept, beds neatly made, belongings stacked in order. The space felt less like a cage and more like a village dormitory, a temporary home built on the ruins of war, but with comfort came conflict within the heart. Soldiers whispered at night, asking questions they could not answer. Was this right? How could life as a prisoner feel better than life as a soldier? Many remembered the mud-filled trenches in North Africa, where men slept shoulder to shoulder in filth. They remembered the bombed-out houses in Sicily, where soldiers curled up in corners like beggars. They remembered boots filled with water, uniforms stiff with dirt, nights so cold that even huddled bodies could not generate warmth. Compared to that, these American barracks seemed like an impossible dream, and yet the dream was real. Evenings were perhaps the most striking. As the sun sank, the camp settled into quiet. Lamps glowed softly in the barracks, casting warm light on wooden walls. Outside, the air cooled, filled with the scent of grass and soil. Italian prisoners sat on their bunks, talking, laughing, sometimes singing low songs of home. No bombs fell, no shells burst. There was only peace. The men looked at one another and felt the weight of an impossible truth. As prisoners, they were safer than they had ever been as free men. The guards, too, seemed strangely distant from the image of cruelty they had been warned of. They walked their rounds with rifles slung, watchful but not aggressive. Orders were firm but not violent. The Italians soon realized that respect was given as long as discipline was kept. This was not a dungeon. It was something else entirely, a system, orderly and almost humane. For some prisoners, the change in environment healed more than their bodies. It soothed their minds. Nightmares of the front still haunted them, but the steady rhythm of clean beds, hot showers, and silent nights began to mend their broken spirits. A few wrote letters home, describing conditions so good that their families refused to believe them. Surely, they thought, their sons and husbands must be exaggerating. Yet the truth was almost beyond belief. The prisoners lived with a dignity that many civilians in war-torn Italy could only dream of. Still, pride remained a complicated burden. Some Italians struggled with shame, feeling that to enjoy these comforts was to betray their homeland. They lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, torn between gratitude and guilt. Others, however, embraced the reality fully. They reasoned that war had taken everything, comrades' honor, homeland, and yet here in captivity they had been given back the smallest luxuries of humanity. Why reject them? Why cling to suffering when comfort was offered freely? Slowly, the barracks transformed into more than shelters. They became symbols of survival. Men decorated their bunks with small carvings, drawings, or letters from home. They hung clothes carefully, swept their sections, and took pride in maintaining order. The camps began to look less like prisons and more like strange, temporary towns, a place where men could endure captivity without being crushed by it. There was a certain irony that every prisoner felt but rarely voiced. The life they lived now was cleaner, safer and more orderly than the life many of them had known as soldiers. Mussolini's war had led them to hunger and death. America's captivity, bizarrely, had led them to beds and shelter. The contradiction was almost too heavy to bear, but it was undeniable. In time, comfort itself became normal. Men no longer gasped at the sight of clean sheets or warm showers. They grew used to sleeping through the night without waking to gunfire. They began to speak not of survival but of living. And though the barbed wire fences remained, and though their freedom was still a dream, the barracks of the American camps gave them something just as precious, the dignity of being treated as men. For those Italian soldiers, captivity was not the torment they had imagined. It was rest. It was healing. It was, in its own strange way, a return to humanity after years of being ground down by war. And long after the war ended, many would look back on those barracks with bittersweet memory, not as prisons, but as the first place they had truly felt safe in years. Work. For most Italian prisoners, the word carried bitter memories. In Mussolini's army, work meant digging trenches under fire, hauling supplies across endless roads, or repairing weapons with bare hands while artillery thundered overhead. It was hardship, obligation, survival. And so, when they first heard that American camps required them to work, many braced for punishment, chains, backbreaking labor, humiliation. Yet what they found was something astonishingly different. Work in America was not suffering. It was purpose. It was rhythm. It was, in its own quiet way, freedom. At dawn, the camp stirred awake. The bugle did not sound like the harsh calls of the front. Instead, guards gave calm instructions, ushering men into organized lines. Some prisoners were assigned to kitchen duty, others to cleaning, others to the wide fields beyond the fences. Groups marched out, watched carefully but not brutally, to tend crops, repair roads, or build simple furniture. For men who had known the chaos of a collapsing army, these routines were strangely soothing. Their hands had been trained to carry rifles, but here they carried tools. They did not destroy, they built. Farming was perhaps the most common work. Many Italian prisoners had grown up as farmers, sons of soil and sun, and the chance to return to that life brought unexpected joy. They dug rows in the earth, planted seeds, watered crops, and harvested vegetables. The land was generous. In the fertile American soil, plants grew tall and strong, a reminder of home, but without the shadow of famine. The Italians labored with energy, singing folk songs as they worked, voices rising in harmony. Guards listened in silence, sometimes even smiling. For a few hours each day, war seemed far away. Inside the camps, carpentry shops buzzed with activity. Prisoners who had once been craftsmen before the war carved wood into chairs, tables, and tools. Their skill impressed the Americans, who allowed them to keep small projects as personal belongings. Some men carved intricate figurines, birds, saints, even models of their villages back in Italy. Others built boxes to hold letters and keepsakes. Each piece of wood carried more than shape. It carried memory, pride, and identity. Work had transformed from an order into an act of creation. Perhaps most surprising of all was the pay. Prisoners earned small wages for their labor, given in tokens or credits, redeemable at the camp canteen. For men who had once fought in rags, the idea of buying goods, even as prisoners, felt surreal. They could purchase cigarettes, candy, postcards, and sometimes even small luxuries like shaving cream or playing cards. The camp canteen became a social center, a place where men gathered after work, trading jokes, swapping stories, and showing off their small treasures. In this way, captivity began to resemble life. Restricted, yes, but full of small freedoms that mattered deeply. Leisure grew alongside labor. Italians played soccer in the open fields, kicking dust into the sky as they cheered one another on. Games of bocce were set up with improvised balls. Music drifted through the camp as men played harmonicas or strummed makeshift guitars. The Americans, realizing the calming effect of these activities, allowed them to continue. What began as work assignments slowly became a community life, balanced between labor and leisure, discipline and humanity. For the prisoners, this balance carried powerful meaning. Work kept them strong, gave them pride, reminded them they were still men, not just numbers behind wire. Leisure reminded them of home, of festivals, of Sundays in village squares. Together, they created a rhythm of days that gave hope, even under captivity. But the deeper truth lay not in the work itself, but in what it represented. For the Italians, every task showed a side of America that defied their expectations. They had been told Americans were brutal conquerors, heartless machines of war. Yet here, in the fields and workshops, they discovered a different reality. A nation that believed even enemies deserved structure, purpose, and a measure of dignity. It was disarming, even confusing. Some prisoners wrestled with guilt, wondering if their loyalty to Italy was weakening. Others embraced the experience fully, quietly admitting that captivity in America gave them more humanity than Mussolini's war ever had. Time passed. Seasons changed. Work in the fields became routine. Crops grew, were harvested, and grew again. Prisoners built tables that stood for years. They carved small figurines that they sent home in letters, tokens of survival and strange gratitude. Soccer games left men sweaty and laughing, collapsing in the dust like boys again. Captivity no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like waiting not in despair, but in strange, unexpected peace. Some prisoners even began to think of the future. Letters home carried hopeful tones. I am well, I am fed, I work, I live. Families in Italy, starving and bombed, read these letters with disbelief. Could it be true that their sons, captured by the Americans, were safer and more comfortable than they themselves were? The irony was bitter, yet comforting. At least their loved ones lived. At least captivity meant survival. For the Italians, the work became memory. Long after the war ended, many would recall those years in American camps, not with hatred, but with a strange nostalgia. They remembered the fields, the workshops, the canteens. They remembered the laughter after games, the cigarettes shared at dusk, the sense that even in defeat, life had continued. Some would even return to America years later, seeking the land that had once held them captive, and yet had shown them unexpected humanity. In the end, work did not feel like punishment. It felt like redemption. It gave men back their pride, their strength, and their sense of belonging. Within the fences of captivity, they rediscovered what war had stolen from them, the ability to live as human beings, not as starving soldiers or broken prisoners. And though the world outside raged with fire and destruction, inside the camps, through work and community, the Italians built something powerful: hope.